3 lines, cold open. A chest was found in the ruins. Inside were ledgers, neat, deliberate, unblinking. Every page whispered the same sin, though the words were careful not to say it.
Welcome back.
Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The documents now called the Marrowfield Papers surfaced in 1962 during the clearing of an old house foundation along the Mississippi River, not far from the vanished town of Briar Run. They were bound in faded calfskin, their ink browned by humidity and time. On the inside cover someone had written, in a precise and practiced hand, "Property of Dr. Nathaniel Wainwright, 1843. Dr. Wainwright was not a physician in the modern sense. Records from Wilkinson County identify him as a planter surgeon, a man of some education who maintained both a plantation and a private study of hereditary vitality. The ledgers seem to mix plantation accounts with anatomical notes, sermons, and small sketches of the human form drawn with unsettling familiarity. At first glance the pages appear routine: births, crop yields, inoculations. But the margins tell another story. Small symbols, initials repeated beside certain names, marks that seem to classify rather than describe. The earliest pages date from March 1843, when the property then known as Marrowfield was thriving. Cotton yields were high. Enslaved labor was recorded as stable. Wainwright, 47, wrote of experimenting toward improvement, a phrase scholars still debate. Some argue he referred to crop rotation or veterinary breeding common to the era. Others, reading between the inked lines, suggest something far darker, an attempt to codify life itself, to shape lineage according to his own moral arithmetic. Contemporary census lists name his household: Demuse, Nathaniel Wainwright, planter and self-styled doctor; Eleanor Wainwright, his wife, described by neighbors as delicate and God-fearing; 3 sons, Thomas, Henry, and Samuel, educated locally, noted for exemplary obedience. The records also mention 71 enslaved persons, none named individually in the legal documents, though their first names appear throughout the ledgers. Visitors of the time remarked upon the order of the estate. The cotton gin, rebuilt in 1840 after storm damage, ran smoothly. The chapel on the hill, small and whitewashed, drew both family and field hands on Sundays under the watch of an armed overseer. To outward appearance, Marrowfield prospered. Only the servants whispered that something in the main house stayed awake long after the lamps were out, that the doctor's study glowed with lamplight until dawn. In an unsigned letter preserved among the papers, a correspondent identified only as J. wrote from New Orleans in June 1843. "Your methods are bold, sir, and I pray Providence guides your hand. The question of inheritance, whether spirit or defect may be corrected through design, will determine the progress of nation." The reply, written in Nathaniel's own hand, and dated July 2 of that year, reads simply, "The brus requires courage and silence." The first real fracture appears later that summer. A fire destroyed part of the cotton house, no lives lost, but the event recurs obsessively in the doctor's notes. He lists every damaged tool, every lost bushel, then adds a line set apart from the rest. The flames were not wild, they sought only the heart. Historians interpret this as an early sign of unrest among the enslaved community, perhaps deliberate sabotage. Whatever its cause, the fire marked a change. The tone of the ledgers hardens. Mentions of discipline and correction increase. The doctor begins writing about control of strain and continuity of yield, as though his laborers were not men and women, but an experiment too delicate to trust to chance. Eleanor's presence in the documents fades during this period. Her neat, flowing script appears only in a few household receipts, and a single surviving letter to her sister in Charleston, written in the trembling language of faith under strain. Nathaniel is changed. His nights are filled with study and command, his days with silence. The children obey but do not question. There is a purpose here I do not understand, only feel. That letter was dated October 1843. The same month a child was born on the plantation under circumstances never explained. The entry reads, 10 October, birth recorded. Strong lung mark the lineage. No mother's name follows. Instead a blank space, and beneath it a small ink blot in the shape of a star. Modern analysts, archivists, genealogists and local historians argue that this omission defines the entire Wainwright record. Each page balances on abs. The more Nathaniel wrote, the less he said. Every number hides a person, every yield hides pain. Yet the writing remains calm, scientific, detached. That composure is the true horror of the Marrowfield Papers, the language of observation used to erase humanity. By late 1843, His eldest son, Thomas, began assisting in what the ledger calls documentation of variance. His handwriting, smaller and more nervous, appears beside notations about growth, temperament and purity. Again, the meaning is left to infer. What is clear is that the family's isolation deepened. Visits to town became rare. The chapel bell rusted silent. Even neighbors began to speak of strange cries carried across the cane fields at night. Half animal, half human, cut short by the whistle of the river wind. Eleanor's mental decline seems to have followed swiftly. An 1844 diary fragment found among the loose papers, likely hers, reads, "I hear the river call names not written in any book. The Lord asks, what has been made in his image, and I have no answer." There the page ends. By the time the 1962 discovery brought these documents to light, much of the physical estate had vanished. Only the stone foundations of the main house and the overgrown family cemetery remained. Local law insisted that nothing would grow on the plot where the cotton house once stood. Even weeds withered there. Soil tests found nothing unusual, only compacted clay and traces of ash, but the superstition persists. People still cross themselves when they drive the old river road past the site, as if to acknowledge an unease older than memory. The first scholars who studied the ledgers described them as the coldest testimony yet found to the logic of ownership. Every effort to soften the language fails because the cruelty lies not in what is said, but in what is measured. Births and deaths are given equal weight, recorded in the same column beside totals of grain. To read these pages is to watch a mind empty itself of empathy in the name of order. Yet in that very precision, we find the trace of conscience. The final entry for 1843, written in a thinner hand, perhaps during illness, states, "The system holds, though the heart weakens. We are all bound by the design we have drawn." No signature follows. The ink fades into a water stain shaped like a human palm. By the spring of 1844, the Wainwright plantation had grown both in reputation and unease. Isaiah's letters to his associates in Natchez were full of figures, bushels, bales, yields. But beneath the columns, one senses an obsessive concern with continuity. "Our prosperity," he wrote that March, "depends upon maintaining the right conditions for increase." The phrase recurs dozens of times, never defined. To the reader of the surviving ledgers, it becomes a kind of refrain, a code that cloaked whatever private experiment occupied the family's attention. Neighbors remarked that the Wainwrights were withdrawn. Invitations to supper went unanswered. Even church attendance, once unfailing, became irregular. Visitors who did arrive found the house in strange order, immaculate rooms on the first floor, but the upper corridors sealed. The shutters were kept closed even in daylight, and faint murmurs carried through the floorboards. One merchant from Woodville wrote later that he had seen children pale as candle wax, walking as though taught their steps by rule, and a wife whose face looked already half in mourning. Isaiah's wife, Ruth, was often glimpsed on the veranda at dawn, reading scripture aloud to no one. Her sister in South Carolina preserved several of Ruth's letters from this time. They are pious, meticulous, and edged with dread. "I strive to keep order among the household, though at night I hear the walls breathe." Isaiah says it is only the wind off the river. The sister's marginal note in a later family Bible reads simply, "Ruth, declining into vision." Among the enslaved community, the records never named them individually. The atmosphere thickened with silence. A carpenter recorded that he had been told not to repair the small cabins near the mill because those dwellings are not to be Another letter mentions that an old woman called H had been confined for speaking of spirits. No further detail survives, only an entry in the physician's account book listing laudanum 2 doses. The plantation's external prosperity continued, yet cracks appeared in its social façade. Isaiah's eldest son, Thomas, newly of age, began overseeing field operations. He was dutiful, efficient, but curiously detached. The overseer complained that Thomas looked through people as though they were glass. A visiting cousin observed that he spoke in his father's phrases, maintenance, continuity, resource, with no reference to the human labor behind them. That habit, once admired as business sense, soon took on a ghostly tone. By late 1844, a fever swept the region. Several field hands died and the county physician advised isolation. Isaiah's response was logistical rather than charitable. He had new fences built around the quarters, limiting movement to preserve the investment. Yet the fever entered the main house anyway. 2 of Ruth's domestic servants died within days. Ruth herself fell ill, but recovered, leaving her voice permanently hoarse. From that point forward, she rarely spoke above a whisper. Her journal found among family papers notes in one trembling line, The Lord has made his displeasure known, yet my husband speaks of numbers. In January 1845, Isaiah recorded a visit from a natural philosopher traveling from New Orleans, a Dr. Caleb Whitfield, who came to observe the arrangement. The entry is curt, but a later letter from Whitfield to a colleague reveals more. The gentleman keeps most exact accounts of births and yields, with charts of lineage more suitable to a kennel than a plantation. He is proud of the method and deaf to moral inquiry. His wife's eyes accuse him even when her lips are still. Whitfield departed after 3 days, declining further correspondence. The encounter marks the first outside witness to what later historians called the Wainwright experiment. Through 1845, small calamities multiplied. A storm struck in June, tearing the roof from the smokehouse and flattening rows of corn. Isaiah blamed insufficient diligence and doubled the required labor. The overseer resigned soon after, claiming he could no longer enforce orders without cruelty unbecoming a Christian. By the spring of 1847, the Wainwright plantation had entered a period of quiet instability. Isaiah, now 55, remained resolute in public appearance, yet the meticulous calm recorded in his ledgers was increasingly at odds with daily reality. Work in the fields continued, but reports from overseers, those few still employed, told of growing absenteeism and subtle resistance. Tools left in plain sight were often missing the next morning. Seedlings carefully planted disappeared overnight. Isaiah's own notes grow increasingly frantic. Diligence must be maintained, contingency measures instituted, faith in order required. The enslaved community had begun to communicate in ways that were invisible to the Wainwrights. Small signals, a marked tree, a deliberately misplaced basket, or a whispered phrase passed warnings of inspection or punishment. One farmer in Woodville later recounted seeing a young woman standing by a fence, watching carefully while the overseer spoke elsewhere, signaling to others when it was safe to move. These acts, though minor in isolation, created a network of awareness that slowly undermined the illusion of total control. Thomas, now fully managing field operations, grew increasingly rigid. He repeated his father's phrases, using abstract terms like continuity and yield to explain actions to the overseers, yet his obsession with procedure could not prevent errors born of fatigue, illness, and defiance. Corn rotted in silos, cotton bolls were left unharvested, and the general productivity of the plantation plateaued, despite additional labor demands. His notes reveal his frustration. The labor is present, yet the results are absent. Discipline enforced, morale remains deficient. Samuel, estranged but present in the city of Natchez, wrote letters to distant relatives describing the environment he had fled. He spoke of a house where numbers mattered more than life, and where obedience was measured by fear rather than devotion. Though these letters were intercepted by Isaiah's agents and destroyed, a copy survives among a cousin's papers, hinting at the family tensions festering beneath the plantation's disciplined exterior. Ruth, confined increasingly to her quarters, exhibited a growing obsession with religious texts. She copied psalms into notebooks, often filling margins with marginalia that historians would later describe as a fragmented morality, haunted by the structure she helped enforce. Her attention shifted from the present to visions of punishment and divine reckoning. By summer, she spoke little to the household, leaving Elizabeth, her youngest, to act as intermediary between her mother and the daily operation of the house. Elizabeth, only 20 at the time, demonstrated a remarkable capacity to internalize her parents' philosophy. Her letters reveal no discomfort in her role, even as she oversaw the arrangements of labor and domestic order. She monitored the children, organized work schedules, and maintained meticulous household accounts. Yet those same letters betray hints of unease in her phrasing, moments where routine terminology slips into metaphor. The vessels remain obedient. I trust the Lord will see to the remainder. The summer of 1848 brought further challenges. A flood along the Mississippi destroyed several acres of cotton, and storage buildings that had been weakened by earlier storms collapsed. Isaiah's reaction was predictably procedural. He documented losses in ledgers, increased work hours, and demanded additional effort from those remaining in service. The enslaved community responded with quiet acts of sabotage. Water channels were rerouted to flood low-lying fields, stored grain was found to be damp or spoiled, and several plows went missing for days. Isaiah's reaction, recorded in his private notes, oscillated between anger and disbelief. How can this persist? Measures enacted, yet the yield diminishes. Compliance fails despite vigilance. The deaths of several enslaved children in late 1848 marked another turning point. A severe outbreak of dysentery claimed 4 children, all under the age of 10. Isaiah listed the losses as a financial deficit, while Ruth recorded in her personal ledger, "The young are taken, and I am powerless. The Lord's wrath lingers over us." A servant, decades later interviewed by the Federal Writers Project, recalled that the children's graves were unmarked beyond crude wooden stakes, and that the community grieved in silence, conscious that outward displays could invite punishment. Isaiah's obsession with maintaining control reached its apex during the winter of 1848. Nighttime inspections became routine. Even small acts of deviation, talking after lights were extinguished, gathering wood without permission, or conversing in hushed tones were subject to scrutiny. His ledger entries become increasingly abstract, surveillance intensified, variances note, continuity of obedience critical. The enslaved community, however, had begun to recognize the limitations of their oppressor. In the quarters, whispers of escape circulate. Plans were drawn with crude maps, showing routes to neighboring plantations where sympathetic enslaved people might offer shelter. One survivor interviewed in 1937 recalled the meticulous secrecy. "We marked trees, we left signs, we spoke only when certain. Every eye watched, every mouth silent, but we learned who we could trust." Isaiah, consumed by his obsession with numbers and method, did not recognize the emergence of a parallel, invisible network undermining his authority. By spring 1849, Isaiah's health had begun to falter. His handwriting in the ledgers grew shakier. Calculations were accompanied by notes of malaise. Dizziness persistent, rest advised, vigilance must not lapse. He delegated increasing responsibility to Thomas, whose practical efficiency often clashed with his father's moral rigidity. Conflicts arose over the allocation of labor, the management of crop rot, and the enforcement of household order. Letters between the two, preserved in a cousin's archives, show Isaiah insisting on absolute adherence to method, while Thomas cautioned that overexertion led to diminishing returns and heightened risk of resistance. Elizabeth continued to enforce household and domestic operations, showing a remarkable capacity for organization under duress. She recorded births and deaths, oversaw meals, and kept track of household supplies, yet even she could not mitigate the growing instability in the field. The combination of crop failure, illness, and subtle acts of resistance left the plantation's output at a fraction of earlier years. Meanwhile, Samuel remained absent, yet his influence persisted in rumor and memory. His disappearance became a cautionary tale, referenced obliquely in household speech. He could not endure the methods of the estate. This warning circulated quietly among the enslaved population, reinforcing their perception that even members of the Wainwright family could reject the system, leaving those who remained trapped in its machinery. The latter half of 1849 marked the beginning of Isaiah's slow physical decline. A minor stroke affected his speech, and he increasingly relied on Thomas for both household decisions and field oversight. His obsession with yield persisted, but entries reveal increasing disorientation, calculations incomplete, orders issued, observation limited by infirmity. Ruth, already withdrawn, declined further contact with daily operations, entrusting Elizabeth with the management of the household, while she remained largely in her quarters, absorbed in religious readings. Within the enslaved community, subtle acts of defiance multiplied. Small fires in storage sheds, intentional misplacement of tools, and the deliberate miscounting of cotton bales occurred with increasing frequency. These acts were coordinated in secret, demonstrating a growing capacity for collective action and intelligence that Isaiah and Thomas failed to anticipate. A diary entry from one overseer, preserved in a local archive, notes, "The people seem more cunning than ever. Their silence speaks volumes. Something is moving beneath the surface." By the end of 1849, the Wainwright plantation had reached a precarious equilibrium. Publicly, it appeared to maintain order, its ledger entries suggesting meticulous management. Privately, however, cracks had begun to undermine the family's control. The physical and mental health of Isaiah and Ruth had deteriorated. Thomas had assumed operational authority, yet lacked the moral or emotional foundation to inspire loyalty, and Elizabeth, though capable, remained isolated. The enslaved population had quietly organized, building knowledge networks, and preparing for eventual freedom, whether through flight, resistance, or circumstance. The surviving documents hint at the growing tension in one particularly revealing ledger entry dated December 1814. This line, almost prophetic, underscores the limits of control, the emergence of resistance, and the moral ambiguity that would define the Wainwright plantation for the decade to come. The following years, 1850-1855, would see these tensions escalate further, culminating in acts that would irreversibly change the estate and its inhabitants. The decade of the 1850s began under a veneer of continuity at the Wainwright plantation, but the surface order belied the turbulence beneath. Isaiah, now in his late 50s, was increasingly debilitated by strokes and chronic illness, his once precise handwriting wavering, and ledger entries reflecting a mind attempting to impose order on chaos. Thomas, now 30, took on almost all field oversight, directing labor and supervising the growing cotton harvest. Elizabeth managed the house and domestic affairs with an almost mechanical diligence, while Ruth, incapacitated by guilt and illness, withdrew entirely into scripture and private reflection. Despite appearances, the enslaved community was quietly transforming. The tactics of passive resistance that had begun in the late 1840s, misplaced tools, spoiled seeds, and subtle disobedience became more organized. Communication between quarters grew sophisticated. Small signals, previously only meant for immediate neighbors, were now understood across the property. Whispers of escape plans circulated in hushed tones, and trusted individuals began scouting possible routes beyond neighboring plantations. The first significant break came in March 8. A group of 4 enslaved men, led by a man named Josiah, carefully gathered provisions and waited for the cover of darkness. Josiah had been born on the Wainwright plantation, but had spent years secretly communicating with enslaved people on nearby estates, learning of sympathetic whites, and mapping the terrain northward toward the Tennessee border. Their knowledge of the surrounding area, combined with careful planning, allowed them to evade detection for nearly 20 miles. Morning roll call revealed the absences, and Thomas, accompanied by 2 overseers and a pair of bloodhounds, pursued the group. Despite the initial success of the escape, all 4 were eventually captured within 3 days. Punishment was swift and brutal. Lashes numbered 20 apiece, and Josiah, as the leader, received 30. The act of defiance, however, had a lasting impact on the enslaved community. The Wainwrights believed that their display of force would reassert control, yet the escape demonstrated both the courage and capability of those they had sought to dominate. Ruth's letters from this period reveal a growing moral fracture. Writing to a sister in Charleston, she confessed, "I fear the Lord's judgment falls upon us, and the screams of those we have wronged haunt me nightly. I see now the faces of the children and mothers, and I cannot dismiss their suffering as before." Isaiah, meanwhile, maintained an unyielding public persona, preaching biblical justifications for slavery to visitors, and asserting that obedience, punishment, and order were divinely sanctioned. The birth of children continued under the oppressive conditions of the breeding program. Elizabeth, now 22, delivered her 3rd child in April 1852, and was immediately expected to resume her role in the systematic arrangements of enslaved pregnancies. Unlike Margaret before her, Elizabeth exhibited no outward signs of distress. In letters to her mother, she described pregnancies as duties to the estate, and births as measurements of progress, language that historians have since interpreted as the deep indoctrination of a generation raised entirely within the plantation's moral and operational framework. By 1853, Isaiah's physical decline accelerated. A particularly severe stroke left him partially paralyzed and unable to write for extended periods. His reliance on Thomas for operational management grew absolute, though Thomas's adherence to his father's rigid routines often clashed with practical necessity. The enslaved population, recognizing the vulnerability of the patriarch, escalated acts of sabotage. Fences were loosened to allow livestock to escape, seed stores were intentionally contaminated, and essential tools disappeared, creating inefficiencies that compounded crop failures. One particularly notable incident occurred in the summer. A small fire was set in a storage shed containing processed cotton. The blaze was discovered early enough to prevent total destruction, yet it destroyed enough bales to register as a significant financial loss in Isaiah's meticulously maintained ledger. Investigation revealed no culprit, prompting Isaiah to select 3 men at random, Peter, Moses, and Elijah, for public whipping. These measures, intended to intimidate, instead reinforced the sense of solidarity among the enslaved. They understood that any act of punishment, no matter how severe, could not erase their capacity for coordinated resistance. Meanwhile, Thomas struggled with the ethical and practical challenges of running the plantation without the direct oversight of his father. While he shared Isaiah's belief in the moral righteousness of slavery, he also recognized that productivity could not be forced beyond the limits of human endurance, and that resentment had tangible consequences. His private notes from this period reflect a growing tension between loyalty to his father and the operational realities of managing an increasingly defiant workforce. Discipline maintained, yet output insufficient. The people grow cunning, cautious. Fear is no longer in. The summer of 1854 saw an outbreak of measles in the quarters. Several children fell ill, and 2, including a daughter of Hannah, did not survive. Isaiah recorded the deaths as financial losses in his ledger. Ruth, confined. By the winter of 1856, the Wainwright plantation had entered a period of heightened tension. Isaiah, now approaching 60, was increasingly feeble. His strokes had left him with limited mobility, and he relied on Thomas for almost every decision regarding labor, crop management and enforcement. Thomas, now 32, had assumed operational control, but the psychological framework imposed by years of filial obedience restrained any meaningful challenge to his father's ideology. Elizabeth, still in her mid-20s, maintained the household, overseeing domestic tasks and supervising enslaved women, but she had absorbed the plantation's moral logic so thoroughly that she saw little cause for concern beyond practical management. The enslaved population, however, was quietly transforming from passive endurance to active resistance. Josiah, who had attempted escape years earlier, had become a clandestine organizer, carefully coordinating efforts to subvert the plantation's oppressive structures. On Sundays, when the enslaved were allowed to attend nearby churches, Josiah and others exchanged information about potential escape routes, sympathetic outsiders, and the political currents stirring tension between North and South. The first major organized escape of this period occurred in February. 3 women, Hannah, Rachel, and Julia, whose lives had been marked by repeated forced pregnancies, reached a breaking point. Hannah had borne 5 children, all removed from her. Rachel had 4, and Julia had 3, all fathered by members of the Wainwright family. They departed separately under cover of darkness, planning to converge 2 miles north at a creek crossing scouted during previous Sunday walks. Their plan was to follow the creek toward Tennessee and eventually further north. Josiah provided guidance and limited intelligence, but the women's lack of weapons and the inherent risks of navigating unfamiliar territory without immediate support made the endeavor perilous. By morning roll call, their absence was noticed. Thomas and Daniel, joined by 2 trusted enslaved trackers and the plantation's bloodhounds, pursued them. The women were discovered hiding in a ravine by early afternoon, their brief taste of freedom extinguished. They were brought back in chains, and Isaiah ordered a public whipping, 10 lashes each, administered between the main house and the quarters. Children watched from windows. The women screamed, their pain echoing across the field. Isaiah addressed the assembled population, framing the punishment as both a moral and property-based obligation. They were ungrateful, rejecting the good treatment of the plantation, and stealing themselves. The punishment left lingering physical and psychological scars. Hannah could barely walk for weeks due to infection. Rachel developed a prolonged fever. Julia survived physically, but lost something of her spirit, working mechanically, her gaze vacant. The public nature of the whippings intensified collective resentment, exposing the brutal realities of the system, while failing to fully reassert control. Samuel Jessup, one of Isaiah's sons who had been forced into participation in the breeding program, witnessed the punishment from his bedroom window. The spectacle catalyzed a confrontation between Samuel and Isaiah that very evening. Samuel accused his father of cruelty and systemic destruction, rejecting his role in the program. Isaiah responded with rage, striking Samuel and threatening to disown him if he refused his duties. Samuel left that night, taking a horse and riding toward Natchez, never to return. Samuel's departure exposed vulnerabilities within the Wainwright family hierarchy. Ruth, mortified, retreated further into private grief and religious meditation. Thomas increased his workload to compensate for the absence of his brother. Daniel and Elizabeth continued their roles without outward dissent, and Isaiah forbade any mention of Samuel, attempting to erase both his physical absence and the ideological challenge he represented. Spring 1857 brought further turmoil. An outbreak of measles claimed the lives of 2 enslaved children, including Clara, daughter of Thomas. Isaiah recorded the deaths as financial losses, reflecting the plantation's prioritization of property over human life. Margaret, now pregnant with her 6th child, experienced profound psychological deterioration. Ruth feared she would not survive childbirth, as Margaret barely ate, flinched at every approach, and spent hours staring vacantly from her bedroom window. In May 1858, Josiah and 4 other men attempted a second escape. this time better prepared with stolen provisions and tools. They left under cover of night, but by Sunday morning their absence was noted. The search extended 3 days due to the group splitting to evade capture. Eventually, all were returned separately. Isaiah, escalating his response, whipped each severely, 20 lashes for most, 30 for Josiah, and sold them immediately to a slave trader who transported them to Louisiana sugar plantations, notorious for brutal conditions. This act sent a clear signal. Escape would be met not only with punishment, but with exile to harsher conditions. The summer of 1858 saw Margaret go into labor. Despite the intervention of Ruth and an experienced enslaved midwife, Bulaher, the birth resulted in her death after 2 hours of hemorrhaging and complication. The baby survived, named Matthew, and was sent to the quarters to be raised by Claudia alongside other children born of the breeding program. Margaret's death marked a turning point for Ruth, who began questioning, privately, the morality of their actions and the system she had helped perpetuate. Elizabeth, indoctrinated from birth, exhibited no moral conflict and quickly resumed participation in the program, becoming pregnant again in September 8. Thomas, now effectively managing the plantation in his father's stead, observed the system's fragility. Productivity had declined, resentment had increased, the enslaved population was openly resistant. He recognized the impracticality of maintaining strict control, but lacked moral motivation to challenge the framework. For Thomas, the plantation was a business, and the decline in labor efficiency presented a practical problem rather than a moral one. In October 1859, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry reverberated across the South. Southern planters, including Isaiah, increased patrols, tightened restrictions, and eliminated the previously allowed Sunday church visits for enslaved people. The atmosphere became increasingly prison-like, with stricter curfews and intensified supervision. Minor infractions were met with severe punishment. Robert was whipped for speaking back to an overseer. Denina was locked in a storage shed for 2 days for tardiness. In December 1859, the first major act of organized sabotage occurred. A fire broke out in the cotton gin building during the night, destroying a significant portion of stored cotton. The flames were carefully set with oil-soaked rags, but no one was harmed. Isaiah demanded confessions and threatened mass punishment. 3 men, Peter, Moses, and James, were whipped as an example, but no one revealed the perpetrator. The fire had been the work of 7 enslaved individuals, who coordinated to exact financial damage without risking life, demonstrating that the enslaved community had moved from passive resistance to active defiance. Over the following months, other acts of sabotage followed. Fences, critical for livestock containment, were damaged, seed corn stores were contaminated, and tools disappeared. Isaiah escalated punishment, but each measure only hardened the resolve of the enslaved population. To neighboring planters, the Wainwright estate appeared orderly, but beneath the surface it was a simmering war zone. Thomas attempted to counsel his father toward moderation, arguing that harsh measures were reducing productivity and increasing risk, but Isaiah refused to yield, committed to the ideology he had spent decades constructing. By the end of 1859, the Wainwright plantation had become a crucible of resistance and oppression. The enslaved population had demonstrated an increasing capacity for coordinated action, intelligence, and patience. They had tested the limits of the family's authority, suffered punishment, and survived. The family, meanwhile, was weakened by internal dissent, illness, death, and moral fracture. Samuel's departure, Margaret's death, and the series of sabotage incidents revealed the inherent instability of a system built on fear, coercion, and brutality. The stage was set for the final years before the Civil War, when the Wainwright plantation would confront the ultimate collapse of its social, economic, and moral structure. The following years would see the intensification of resistance, the breakdown of control, and the inexorable approach of freedom for those who had endured decades of bondage. By the winter of 1860, the Wainwright plantation was teetering on the edge of chaos. The national political landscape mirrored the fractures within the family and the enslaved population. Abraham Lincoln's election in November 1860 had inflamed Southern anxieties. South Carolina seceded in December, and by January 1861 Mississippi had followed. The Confederate States of America were formed, and war seemed inevitable, though few anticipated its duration or the scale of bloodshed it would entail. Isaiah Wainwright, increasingly frail at 53, attended local secessionist meetings in Woodville. He spoke passionately about property rights, states' rights, and the biblical justification for slavery, framing the institution as both morally correct and economically necessary. He remained blind to the systemic horrors perpetrated on his own plantation, the breeding program, the separations of mothers and children, and the constant fear inflicted on the enslaved population. Ruth, broken by years of complicity and guilt, retreated almost entirely from active participation in plantation life. She spent long hours reading scripture, praying, and writing letters to her sister in South Carolina, chronicling her growing sense of despair and foreboding. Elizabeth, now in her 20s, maintained household operations, but had neither the authority nor the inclination to manage field labor effectively. She gave birth to her second child in February 1860, and immediately resumed participation in the breeding program, unaffected by the moral conflicts that had shattered her sister Margaret and haunted Ruth. Elizabeth's psychological resilience, or more accurately, her indoctrination, made her the most terrifying product of the system. She accepted cruelty as normal, and saw nothing wrong in perpetuating it. Thomas, now 33, oversaw the plantation with a practical eye. He observed the rising hostility among the enslaved population, the decline in field productivity, and the growing inefficiency of the plantation system. While he recognized the system's unsustainability, he lacked the moral framework to initiate reform. To him, the plantation was a business, and the erosion of control posed practical, not ethical problems. The enslaved community, however, was increasingly emboldened. The fire set in December 1859 had demonstrated that collective action could exact tangible damage. Small acts of sabotage continued through 1860. Fences were cut, stored supplies were ruined, and tools disappeared. The enslaved people learned patience, coordination, and the power of subtle resistance. Though they could not yet escape en masse, they could assert control over small domains, and signal their refusal to accept total domination. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, formally beginning the Civil War. Thomas enlisted in a Mississippi regiment, followed by Daniel in May. With the sons gone, day-to-day operations fell increasingly to Isaiah and the overseers. The breeding program continued, but without the meticulous attention previously enforced by Thomas. Isaiah's health declined further. Strokes and age left him confined to a wheelchair, increasingly unable to assert control over the plantation. The war years brought disruption. The Union blockade of southern ports restricted the sale of cotton, and Confederate currency rapidly depreciated. Food, clothing, and essential supplies were diverted to support the army. The plantation's infrastructure decayed. Buildings went unrepaired, fields were partially planted, and labor was performed under minimal supervision. Despite these challenges, the enslaved population gained hope, fueled by rumors of Union advances, emancipation, and escape opportunities. By 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation further strengthened their resolve. Freedom was no longer an abstract concept, but a tangible, approaching reality. Tragedy continued for the Wainwright family. Thomas was killed at the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862, and Daniel succumbed to dysentery in a Virginia military camp in Isaiah, now in his 60s, grieved the loss of his heirs, his carefully constructed multi-generational empire crumbling with the deaths of the sons he had groomed to perpetuate the breeding program. Ruth died in her sleep in August 1864, her body failing under the weight of guilt, grief, and years of complicity. By early 1865, the Wainwright plantation was a shadow of its former self. Isaiah, 67, and in failing health, was increasingly confused. Elizabeth, now 26, attempted to maintain operations but was overwhelmed by the absence of workforce, the collapse of financial systems, and the physical degradation of the plantation. Overseers had either joined the army or fled. The enslaved population, numbering 73, remained on the property, largely waiting for the arrival of Union forces. Buildings were deteriorating, fields were poorly maintained, and the cotton gin never rebuilt after the 1859 fire remained in ruin. In April 1865, news reached Wilkinson County that the Confederacy had surrendered. Union troops arrived in Woodville in May, and an officer formally informed Isaiah and Elizabeth that slavery had been abolished. Isaiah, weakened by stroke, could barely comprehend the news. Elizabeth argued with the officer, insisting that the people on the plantation were her property and demanding compensation for their freedom. The officer explained that slavery was abolished by constitutional amendment, and that compensation would not be provided. The formerly enslaved people gathered their belongings and began leaving the plantation. Some departed immediately, walking away from the only world they had known. Others remained for weeks, uncertain where to go or how to survive in a free society. By July 1865, only a few elderly individuals remained. Hannah, the first woman forced into the breeding program, left with her surviving children and eventually reached Memphis, Tennessee, where she found work and lived until Rachel moved west toward Vicksburg with her child. Julia, who had never fully recovered from years of psychological trauma, required persuasion to leave, ultimately traveling to a Freedmen's Bureau camp for assistance. The children fathered by the Wainwright men dispersed wide. Many changed their surnames, severing ties to the family that had enslaved their mothers. Some became farmers, others moved to cities, and a few secured education, becoming teachers or ministers. Trauma remained a pervasive legacy, carried silently for generations. Isaiah Wainwright died in October 8, while the official cause was listed as stroke complications. His death was as much the result of the collapse of the world he had known. Elizabeth attempted to continue plantation operations but lacked resources, workforce and capital. By 1867 she sold the property for a fraction of its former value to a northern investor, who subdivided it into smaller farms. Elizabeth relocated to Mobile, Alabama, living with distant relatives. She never married, never publicly discussed the plantation or her family, and died in 1891 at age 52. Samuel Jessup, who had fled the plantation in 1859, survived the war years under assumed names, working sporadically in Natchez and New Orleans. He never overcame his alcoholism, and died of liver failure in 1872. Estranged and alone, the Wainwright plantation itself was eventually divided into smaller farms by the main house, stripped of furnishings and abandoned, collapsed over the following decade. Slave quarters rotted, the family cemetery became overgrown, and the cotton gin site was plowed under. Children born from the breeding program and their descendants scattered across the South, often unaware of their origin. DNA testing in recent years has confirmed links between descendants of the enslaved population and the Wainwright family, corroborating historical records. Oral histories collected during the 1930s by the Federal Writers Project preserved the voices of those who had endured the plantation. Patients, born on the plantation in 1854, recalled, "Mr. Wainwright ran that place like he was God himself. He decided who born, who live, who sold away. His own children did what he said, every one of them. We wasn't people to them, we was crops they was grow." These testimonies, alongside surviving ledgers, letters and county records, provide stark evidence of the breeding program and its horrors. The Wainwright case was legal under Mississippi law, and the Confederacy. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Wainwright plantation had largely vanished from the landscape. The main house had collapsed, the slave quarters rotted into the earth, and the family cemetery had become overgrown and almost forgotten. The physical remnants of the breeding program and the plantation's brutal history were buried, but the human legacy endured, woven into the lives of those born into enslavement, those who had survived and the descendants of the Wainwright family. The children fathered by the Wainwright men faced complex lives. Many had been raised under the constant gaze of the white family, witnessing the systematic abuse of their mothers. Upon emancipation, they scattered across the South, often adopting new surnames to sever ties with their oppressors. Some moved westward, taking advantage of the Homestead Act and acquiring land in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. Others migrated north, settling in cities such as Memphis, New Orleans, Chicago, and St. Louis, seeking opportunities for work and education denied to their parents. Hannah, the first woman forced into the breeding program, became a symbol of resilience. After walking north to Memphis with her surviving children, she secured employment as a washerwoman, and later assisted in local African-American community initiatives. She lived until 1889, leaving descendants who gradually integrated into the economic and social life of Tennessee. Rachel, traveling west toward Vicksburg, established a small farm with her children, teaching them the value of self-reliance and community. Julia, traumatized by decades of abuse, initially struggled to survive. After emancipation, she found support at a Freedmen's Bureau camp, and eventually learned to navigate the new social realities of freedom, though she carried her psychological scars until her death. The children of the Wainwright family had a contrasting experience. Samuel Jessup, who had fled the plantation in 1859, remained estranged from the family, drifting through work in Natchez and New Orleans under assumed name. Alcohol became his refuge, and he died in 1872, alone and largely forgotten. Elizabeth Wainwright, who had managed the plantation briefly after Isaiah's death, eventually sold the property and she relocated to Mobile, Alabama, living with distant relatives, never marrying or speaking publicly about the plantation. She died in 1891, leaving no heirs and preserving in silence the secrets of her family's atrocity. Thomas and Daniel, the other sons, had died during the war, leaving no opportunity to continue the family lineage or reconcile with the consequences of their actions. Despite the physical disappearance of the plantation, evidence of the breeding program survived. Isaiah Wainwright's meticulous ledgers, intended to document human reproduction as property management, survived through accident. The ledgers were stored in a locked trunk that eventually passed to a distant relative of Ruth Wainwright in South Carolina. In 1962, during the cleaning of an attic, the descendant discovered the trunk and its contents, handwritten records documenting pregnancies, births, sales, and assignments of enslaved children and women. The ledgers shocked the family and prompted immediate donation to a university archive, where they became accessible to historians. Alongside the ledgers, county records, letters, and oral histories preserved further evidence of the Wainwright plantation's operation. Federal Writers Project interviews conducted in the 1930s recorded first-hand accounts of individuals who had lived on the plantation. These testimonies offered vivid and personal recollections, corroborating the documentary evidence and providing context for the trauma endured. An elderly woman named Patience, born in 1854, described the plantation in blunt terms. "Mr. Wainwright run that place like he was God himself. He decided who born, who live, who sold away. His own children did what he said, every one of them. We wasn't people to them. We was crops they was growing." Such narratives illustrated not only the cruelty of the system, but also its normalization. Church members, business associates, and neighbors described the Wainwright family as devout, respectable, and upstanding. Outside observers had no reason or perhaps no courage to intervene. The horror had been hidden in plain sight, legitimized by law, social conventions, and the perceived sanctity of property right. Historians studying the ledgers and oral testimonies have emphasized the systematic nature of the breeding program. Isaiah Wainwright documented at least 47 children born from forced relationships between enslaved women and his family, though the actual number may have been high. Approximately 30 of these children survived to see emancipation. Descendants today number in the hundreds, dispersed across the United States, many unaware of their lineage. DNA testing in recent years has confirmed connections between descendants of the enslaved population and the Wainwright family, providing scientific verification of historical accounts. Some descendants have sought each other out, forming connections across racial lines born from shared history. Others have chosen not to investigate, finding the truth too painful to confront. The psychological impact on all participants was profound. Enslaved women bore children under coercion, often losing them to sale or assignment. They lived with constant fear, surveillance, and the trauma of sexual violence. Their descendants inherited the consequences of these experiences, carrying emotional and familial burdens across generations. The Wainwright children, raised within a system of normalized abuse, were themselves psychologically damaged. Thomas and Daniel, who fought and died in the Civil War defending the very system that had corrupted them, illustrate how deeply indoctrination can warp moral judgment. Samuel's flight and subsequent self-destruction revealed the destructive potential of guilt unacknowledged or unmanageable. Elizabeth, indoctrinated from childhood, participated without moral conflict, embodying the terrifying efficacy of systematic ideological conditioning. Ruth and Isaiah, as architects of the breeding program, lived long enough to witness its collapse, yet never admitted responsibility. They remained convinced of their righteousness and victimhood, despite the suffering they had caused. The case of the Wainwright plantation is not unique but notable for its documentation. Similar breeding programs occurred across the South, often hidden and unrecorded. The meticulousness of Isaiah Wainwright's ledgers, combined with surviving oral histories, provides an unusually detailed account of the mechanisms and consequences of such programs. These records allow historians to trace the impact on families, communities, and individual psyches, offering rare insight into the full scale of generational trauma caused by the institution of slavery. One of the most striking aspects of the Wainwright case is the normalcy of the perpetrators in the eyes of their contemporaries. Isaiah and Ruth Wainwright were perceived as pious, respectable, and competent. Their actions were protected by law and social convention, demonstrating how systemic oppression can flourish when legal and cultural systems validate it. This underscores the difficulty of achieving justice within a society structured around property, hierarchy, and racialized power. No legal investigation, no criminal charges, and no formal accountability ever touched Isaiah Wainwright. His authority was absolute, and he wielded it with ruthless efficiency. The rediscovery of the ledgers in 1962 provided a crucial historical record. Scholars and descendants gained access to verifiable evidence of the breeding program, allowing the Wainwright story to enter academic discourse and public consciousness. The ledgers, combined with letters, county records and oral testimonies, form a triangulated evidence base, documenting the operation of the plantation, the cruelty inflicted, and the survival strategies employed by the enslaved community. The Wainwright case also highlights the complexity of memory and narrative in post-slavery America. Descendants of the enslaved population carry stories of trauma, resilience, and survival. Some have sought to reclaim lost histories and establish familial connections, severed by the plantation system. Others prefer silence, a protective mechanism against the pain of confronting generational violence. Descendants of the Wainwright family, meanwhile, often face the challenge of reconciling social respectability with documented moral atrocities. These dual narratives, of oppressors and the oppressed, intersect in ways that continue to shape historical understanding, memory, and identity. Ultimately, the Wainwright plantation illustrates the comprehensive reach of slavery's violence. The institution transformed family structures, psychological development, and intergenerational trajectories. Women and children were coerced, trafficked, and objectified. White family members were indoctrinated to normalize brutality, perpetuate hierarchy, and suppress conscience. The enslaved, despite systemic oppression, found avenues for resistance, ranging from escape to sabotage. The Civil War and emancipation ended the legal framework of slavery, but the social, psychological, and economic effects persisted for decades. The survival of documentary evidence allows historians to piece together a comprehensive picture of one plantation's operation. Isaiah Wainwright's ledgers, in particular, provide a cold, systematic record of human exploitation, showing how meticulous record-keeping was used to perpetuate control. Oral histories, interviews conducted in the 1930s, and modern genealogical research enrich the narrative, providing voice to those who had been silent. The combination of these sources ensures that the reality of the Wainwright plantation is not forgotten, and that the lives of those affected, enslaved, oppressors, and descendants alike, are documented with clarity and precision. The Wainwright story also serves as a broader reflection on the mechanisms of systemic oppression. The breeding program was a direct extension of slavery's dehumanizing logic, treating human beings as property, commodifying reproduction, and rationalizing cruelty through legal, religious, and cultural framework. The psychological, moral, and societal consequences were profound, demonstrating how a system designed for profit and control can distort human relationships and ethical reasoning across generations. In the final analysis, the Wainwright plantation is a case study in the intersection of power, ideology, and human suffering. The meticulous records, surviving narratives, and generational consequences underscore the pervasive impact of slavery. They reveal how cruelty can be normalized, how individuals can be complicit, and how acts of resistance, however small, can affirm human dignity. The story of the enslaved people of the Wainwright plantation is one of endurance, survival, and eventual freedom. Their descendants, scattered and diverse, carry the legacy of trauma, memory, and resilience, offering a testament to the human capacity to endure injustice and reclaim agency, even in the aftermath of systematic dehumanization. The Wainwright ledgers, rediscovered in the 20th century, now stand as a stark reminder of history's realities. They testify to atrocities committed under the guise of normalcy, illuminating the depths of moral compromise and systemic cruelty. The story of Isaiah, Ruth, Elizabeth, and the enslaved individuals on the Wainwright plantation serves as a lasting testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of calculated oppression, and a call to remember the lives and experiences of those who suffered under slavery's shadow. By the end of the Civil War, the world the Wainwright family had built lay in ruins. The plantation, once a sprawling complex of wealth and cruelty, was now a shadow of its former self. Isaiah Wainwright, confined to a wheelchair and broken by age and illness, could barely grasp the reality that the system he had defended for decades had been dismantled. Elizabeth, his youngest daughter, clung stubbornly to the notion of ownership, but she had no means to sustain the estate. With the plantation workforce gone, the cotton gin destroyed, and Confederate currency worthless, the Wainwright empire crumbled. The formerly enslaved people who had survived the horrors of the plantation finally tasted freedom. They left the fields, the quarters, and the overseers behind. Some walked for miles toward towns and cities, seeking work and new lives. Others followed rumors of Union protection, heading to Freedmen's Bureau camps, where they could rebuild communities and claim a fragment of autonomy. Those who had endured generations of systematic rape and forced reproduction carried trauma that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Yet in that freedom lay the seed of resilience. Hannah, Rachel, and Julia, whose lives had been so violently constrained, survived and carved paths for themselves and their children, carrying forward stories of endurance, hope, and survival. The children born from the Wainwright breeding program, numbering at least 47 in the meticulous ledgers, scattered across the South, most took new names, rejecting any association with the family that had enslaved their mothers. Some became farmers, teachers, ministers, or laborers. The trauma of their origins often went unspoken, passed down silently through generations, yet the genetic and social legacies of the Wainwright plantation remained, woven into the lives of hundreds of descendants, who would only later discover the truths of their ancestry. Historical records, oral testimonies, and rediscovered ledgers reveal the stark normalcy with which such atrocities were carried out. Neighbors, church members, and business associates saw the Wainwrights as respectable, pious, and industrious. No one intervened. The system of slavery, supported by laws, culture, and silence, made horror invisible to those who chose not to see it. The Wainwright case was not an anomaly. It was a horrifyingly accurate example of how the institution of slavery functioned, reducing humans to property while cloaking brutality in everyday respectability. In the 20th century, the discovery of Isaiah Wainwright's ledgers in a South Carolina attic, coupled with oral histories collected during the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s, allowed historians to reconstruct the full scope of the plantation's operation. These documents verified accounts of forced breeding, systematic abuse, and the dehumanization of generations of enslaved people. For the descendants of those enslaved, the records were both a revelation and a reckoning, confirming truths that had been whispered for decades, but never documented. Modern descendants of the Wainwright enslaved population face a complex legacy. DNA testing in recent years has confirmed genetic links to the Wainwright family, establishing undeniable connections across racial and historical divides. Some descendants have chosen to acknowledge these ties, forming relationships with newfound relatives, and confronting the painful realities of their ancestry. Others have chosen distance, finding the truth too traumatic to confront. The echoes of the plantation, its violence, exploitation.
Decades after the fall of the Wainwright plantation, the descendants of both the enslaved and the enslavers continued to grapple with the consequences of the past. The land that had once been a site of cruelty and profit was divided into smaller farms, worked by free laborers who had no memory of the suffering embedded in the soil. The main house, stripped of its grandeur, slowly deteriorated, leaving only foundation stones and overgrown paths as silent witnesses to the horrors that had occurred there. The slave quarters rotted and disappeared entirely, while the family cemetery, once maintained meticulously, became nearly impossible to locate amid the wilderness that had reclaimed the plantation grounds. For the descendants of the enslaved, survival was only the beginning. Many carried the trauma of generations, an invisible inheritance of grief, fear, and resilience. Names once recorded in ledgers as property were changed, reclaimed, or reinvented. Some descendants sought education, community leadership, and economic stability as a way to reclaim agency over their lives. Others grappled with the silence of their families, the stories too painful or too shaming to speak aloud. Oral histories preserved in the 20th century, along with DNA evidence, revealed hidden connections across families and regions, linking individuals to ancestors who had endured unimaginable suffering. The Wainwright family, in contrast, largely vanished from public memory. Isaiah's death in 1865 marked the collapse of the system he had built, but his surviving daughter, Elizabeth, struggled to sustain any semblance of the plantation legacy. Selling the property in 1867 for a fraction of its former value, she moved to Mobile, Alabama, living quietly and privately until her death in 18. Samuel Jessup, who had fled in 1859, survived the war years but never overcame his guilt and alcoholism, dying in obscurity. Thomas and Daniel, whose lives had been shaped and poisoned by their upbringing, died young in the Civil War. Margaret and Ruth, the women who had overseen and participated in the system, died broken, one in childbirth, the other under the weight of guilt. The family that had once wielded absolute power was extinguished, leaving little trace beyond crumbling ruins and fading names in legal records. Historians studying the Wainwright plantation in the late 20th and early 21st centuries emphasized its broader significance. While forced breeding and systemic sexual exploitation occurred on other plantations, the meticulous records Isaiah Wainwright kept made this case uniquely well documented. The ledgers, alongside letters, county records, and oral histories, provide a rare, unflinching view into the mechanisms of control, dehumanization and profit-driven exploitation that slavery entailed. They reveal how the institution of slavery was maintained not only through law and violence, but through the normalization of cruelty within families, communities and religious justification. The descendants of those enslaved on the Wainwright plantation, now spread across the United States, carry their histories silently, though DNA testing in recent years has illuminated previously unknown connections. Some have sought out their distant relatives from the Wainwright line, confronting painful truths about ancestry and inheritance. Others have chosen not to engage, finding that the psychological cost of acknowledgement is too high. These modern interactions, fraught with tension and complexity, highlight the lingering legacy of slavery, its ability to shape family, identity, and societal memory long after legal emancipation. The Wainwright case also serves as a moral and educational touchstone. Scholars, activists, and educators use the plantation's history to illustrate the extremes of systemic oppression and the human capacity for both cruelty and resilience. It demonstrates that the legality of an action does not equate to its morality, and that ordinary people, neighbors, church members, business associates can enable atrocity through indifference or compliance. It reminds us that trauma is intergenerational, that survival is an act of defiance, and that historical reckoning requires confronting uncomfortable truths. Even in the absence of physical structures, the stories of those who lived, suffered, resisted, and survived endure. Hannah, Rachel, Julia, and the other enslaved people of the plantation became symbols of endurance, representing the strength required to survive in an environment designed to destroy both body and spirit. Their children and grandchildren, scattered across the South and beyond, inherited not only the pain of their lineage, but the resilience of their ancestors. Each life rebuilt, each story told, became a reclamation of humanity stripped away for decades. In the end, the Wainwright plantation is a study in contrasts. Wealth, built on suffering, piety coexisting with cruelty, apparent normalcy masking horrific abuse. The legacy of Isaiah Wainwright and his family is a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the human capacity for rationalized evil. The legacy of those they enslaved is one of survival, resilience, and the quiet power of freedom reclaimed against overwhelming odds. The echoes of this history continue to reverberate, informing our understanding of race, power, and morality in America, and ensuring that the horrors of the past are neither forgotten nor repeated. The Wainwright story ultimately asks a difficult question: what do we owe to those whose suffering was rendered invisible for so long? The answer lies in remembrance, education, and acknowledgement. Through careful study of records, oral histories, and genetic evidence, we can bear witness to the human cost of systemic injustice. We can honor the resilience of those who endured, and ensure that the horrors they faced are neither minimized nor erased. In doing so, we confront a past that is painful but necessary, and we take steps toward a more honest reckoning with history. The story of the Wainwright plantation, spanning from 1835 to the end of the Civil War, is a chilling testament to the extremes of human cruelty, the machinery of systemic oppression, and the endurance of the human spirit. From Isaiah Wainwright's meticulous management of a breeding program to the silent resilience of the enslaved people he controlled, the plantation embodies the full moral contradictions of American slavery: prosperity built on brutality, social respectability masking monstrous acts, and law codifying inhumanity. Isaiah Wainwright, Ruth, and their children, Thomas, Daniel, Samuel, Elizabeth, and Margaret, lived lives of relative comfort and social standing, while orchestrating a system that systematically dehumanized and exploited hundreds. They participated in rape, forced reproduction, and family separations, rationalizing their actions as Christian duty, economic necessity, or family loyalty. Yet the collapse of their household during the Civil War revealed the fragility of a world built on oppression. Sons died in battle, daughters succumbed to guilt and childbirth, and the plantation itself fell into decay. The illusion of control crumbled as the enslaved people, long subjected to unimaginable cruelty, finally achieved freedom. The enslaved individuals who survived the Wainwright plantation, Hannah, Rachel, Julia, Josiah, and countless others, represent a legacy of resilience and defiance. Through escape attempts, acts of sabotage, and the simple act of enduring, they reclaimed their agency in a system designed to erase it. Post-emancipation, their descendants dispersed, taking new names, building new lives, and carrying the invisible inheritance of trauma. Some confronted their lineage and sought connections across racial lines, while others chose silence to protect themselves from the weight of memory. DNA testing and oral histories have illuminated these hidden networks, providing scientific and narrative proof of the realities that led to the creation of hundreds of lives under coercion. Historically, the Wainwright plantation serves as a unique case study due to the meticulous documentation left behind. Isaiah's ledgers, letters, and the oral histories, recorded decades later, preserve a detailed record of systemic sexual exploitation and dehumanization, revealing the mechanisms by which slavery operated not only as an economic institution, but as a tool of social and psychological control. The Wainwright case illustrates that the horror of slavery was often hidden in plain sight, shielded by legality, social norms, and the complicity of observers who accepted appearances over reality. The broader lessons of this history are profound. The Wainwright story demonstrates the dangers of absolute power, the ways ideology can justify atrocity, and the enduring impact of trauma across generations. It reminds us that the legacies of slavery persist long after legal emancipation, in family histories, cultural memory, and social inequality. The story also emphasizes the resilience of the human spirit, the courage to resist, the strength to survive, and the determination to reclaim dignity, despite impossible odds. For modern readers, the Wainwright plantation is more than a historical curiosity. It is a moral mirror, reflecting uncomfortable truths about human capacity for cruelty when unchecked by conscience, law, or community accountability. It challenges us to consider how societal structures can normalize violence, exploit vulnerability, and perpetuate suffering under the guise of legitimacy. At the same time, it encourages recognition of courage, endurance, and the transformative power of freedom, highlighting the ways individuals and communities can assert agency, even in the most oppressive circumstances. Ultimately, the Wainwright story concludes not with simple justice, but with complex remembrance. The enslaved people achieved freedom, scattered across the United States, carrying with them both the scars of bondage and the strength to build new lives. The Wainwright family line faded into obscurity, their power and influence dissolved, leaving behind only records, ruins, and a cautionary legacy. By studying, preserving, and acknowledging this history, we honor the survivors and confront the moral failures of those who perpetrated the system. The legacy of the Wainwright plantation endures as both a warning and a call to conscience, to recognize the humanity of all individuals, to challenge systems of oppression, and to ensure that the horrors of the past are neither forgotten nor repeated. The echoes of these lives, both enslaved and enslaver, remind us that history is not merely a record of events, but a reflection of moral choices, human resilience, and the consequences of unchecked power. In remembering the Wainwright plantation, we acknowledge the pain, honor the endurance of those who survived, and commit ourselves to a more just understanding of history. The story of the Wainwright plantation may be rooted in a specific place and time, but its lessons resonate universally. It is a testament to the enduring need for vigilance, empathy, and justice, a reminder that freedom and humanity, once taken, must be fiercely protected, and that the cost of ignoring injustice is measured not just in history books, but in lives lived and lost.